Hey everyone, and welcome to a brand new video. Tonight we have just a little bit over 2 hours worth of horror stories as per usual. I hope you all enjoy them. If you do, let's aim for 1100 likes. I think we could do it. Subscribing if you're new is also very much appreciated, as I post content just like this as often as possible. I feel like my voice is making a lot of progress. I've, at the very least, found a pitch and resonance that I can stay in. I think one of my biggest issues before was that I tried so hard with the pitch, and high voice does not equal good voice, and just been working really hard on like toning that down and focusing more on like my inflections and stuff. I feel like there's been a lot of progress. I now get mammed when I'm on the phone, which is really cool because I've never had that before. I don't know. I feel like there's a lot of progress. I feel like things are happening a lot better this time around. Want to say a quick thank you to everyone who has been sticking with me through this. I am really excited to just keep on dialing it in, keep working on it, and eventually be able to develop a voice that can draw an audience again. I think we have it in us, and I just wanted to say thank you. Anyway, enjoy the video. This is a really, really good lineup, by the way. I think y'all will enjoy it. And as always, I hope you all have a great night. We got married last September. The weather had still been decently warm, and the falling leaves made for great wedding pictures. My wife Christy had always been the shy and timid type, preferring to stay in over going out, and I loved her for it. I wasn't much of a party goer myself, aside from the occasional night out with the guys. I'd been the first in my circle of friends to get married and was often subjected to jokes about the opportunities I was supposedly missing. I laughed them off for the most part, chalking their humor up to their lack of experience and possibly even jealousy. However, being only 25, I couldn't help feeling slightly envious of their carefree ways. I came home from the bar one night to find Christy fast asleep in our bed. I remember thinking it quite peculiar, as it was only about 9 o'clock. I'd had a couple of beers, which was how I justified tripping over the magazine rack in the hallway. It tipped over with a clatter. "Henry?" My wife muttered in her sleep. "Is that you?" I assured her it was as she pulled the covers to her chin and drifted off again. In spite of myself, I felt a pang of disappointment. I hadn't been expecting anything, of course, but I couldn't help thinking back on the hubbub of the bar, where most of my friends had scored dates for the night. Don't get me wrong, I wasn't jealous. Christy and I were the perfect match. I just wished our relationship had the same liveliness as it did when we first met. As you may have already guessed, that was the evening when, driven by boredom, as well as a splash of alcohol, I decided to play what I deemed to be a small and harmless prank on my wife. It was very simple, but I knew it would be effective. All I did was place an empty condom wrapper on the bathroom sink. I thought it was hilarious at the time and couldn't wait to see her reaction. Unfortunately, as is common for alcohol-infused decisions, I came to regret my prank the following morning. I woke up to Christy shaking my arm. "What's this?" She held the wrapper up to my crusty eyes. I said, smacking my lips and attempting to turn onto my side. "Henry?" she demanded, hitting me with her fist. I cracked my eyes open to see what the fuss was about. "It's a condom wrapper," I said defiantly. Christy looked wounded. "I can see that, but what was it doing on our bathroom counter?" I sighed, exasperated. The prank no longer seemed funny to me, and all I wanted to do was go back to sleep. What was she doing up so early anyway? "I forgot to throw it away," I mumbled, pulling the covers over my face. She didn't say anything, and when the silence grew too uncomfortable to bear, I stuck my nose out to look at her. Tears were rolling down her cheeks and splashing onto the bed. I couldn't keep my facade up any longer. "Calm down, Christy. It was just a prank," I said, taking the wrapper from her and sitting her down on the bed. "Please don't cry." I wanted her to get back into bed to cuddle and make up, but she got up and stormed out of the room. I knew the prank hadn't been funny, but I certainly hadn't anticipated this reaction. I wasn't too worked up about it, though. Christy wasn't one to hold a grudge, and I figured the matter would blow over by lunchtime. Except it didn't. Christy wouldn't talk to me for the rest of the day. It was a Saturday, and we normally went shopping together, but that day she went alone. She wouldn't even join me for our weekly movie marathon and went to bed early without saying a word. "Christy," I said, following her into the bedroom. "I'm sorry. It was just a stupid prank. I didn't mean to hurt your feelings." She looked at me indignantly. "It's all right, Henry. I understand." I wasn't sure that she did. We had never had an argument like this before, and I was beginning to worry about what I'd have to do to atone for my foolish mistake. When I woke up the following morning, I found Christy's side of the bed empty. The distant clatter of dishes and smell of coffee suggested she was making breakfast. I had no idea what kind of mood she was in, so I felt wary as I entered the kitchen. "Good morning," I said, lightly tapping her on the shoulder. "That smells good." She smiled at me, and for a second it seemed like she had forgotten all about the prank. "This is for you," she said, placing a cup of coffee on the table in front of me. "The omelet will be done in a minute." I beamed at her. After yesterday's falling out, I was just happy to have my wife back. I sat down and took a sip of coffee. It took a second for my brain to register what had happened. I spat the mouthful back into the cup, grimacing and coughing up what I'd already swallowed. "What the?" I snapped, wiping my salty lips with the back of my hand. I could see Christy pressing her lips together, and I knew she was trying to suppress a laugh. "It's all right," she said, smirking. "It's just a prank." Despite the foul taste in my mouth, I chuckled. I couldn't blame her for trying to get back at me. After all, the prank I had played on her was far more vicious, and I was pleased she had forgiven me. "Good one," I grinned. What was supposed to be a one-off turned into a daily habit. Every day I'd be subjected to a new prank, a new hobby taken up by Christy. At first, her pranks were relatively run-of-the-mill and innocent. She signed me up for several obscure email newsletters, dipped my fingers into warm water while I was asleep, and put cream cheese in my stick deodorant. I always laughed them off, not wanting to undermine her efforts, and I didn't really mind either way, relishing in the newfound excitement it had brought to our relationship. Soon enough, however, the mild inconveniences were replaced by borderline sinister stunts. She put laxatives in my food, scalded my feet with boiling water, and hid a dead mouse in one of my lunchbox compartments. "You need to stop," I told her one night after I discovered she'd put stinging nettles in my underwear. "It's not funny anymore." "It's only a bit of fun," she said, her eyes twinkling. "It's not fun," I objected. "And I've had enough." The following morning, however, I realized my objections hadn't had any effect. As soon as I got out of bed, I stepped onto one of Christy's hair styling appliances. It was plugged in and turned up to about 1,000,000 degrees. I fell to my knees, banging my head on the wall in the process. The skin on the sole of my foot was sweltering, and the smell of my own burning flesh was making me want to retch. Despite having several meetings planned for the day, I had no choice but to call in sick. Needless to say, I was furious and planned on giving Christy a piece of my mind when she came home from work. That afternoon, one of my closest friends, Kevin, came over to watch the game. Initially, I had suggested going to a bar, but he'd insisted. He'd asked me why I was suddenly so rigid about having him over, and I told him it was for fear of my wife lurking around the corner at any given moment. He was shocked to hear about our falling out, as Christy and I had always been on such good terms. "Why don't you prank her back?" he suggested. Show her you're not totally helpless. I thought about it for a minute. I knew fighting fire with fire was rarely the best solution, but talking hadn't helped, and it didn't seem as though she was planning to stop anytime soon. Perhaps giving her a taste of her own medicine would help her come to her senses. Well, what could I do? I asked, gesturing to my swollen foot. I'm not exactly in the best shape. Well, Kevin rubbed his nose thoughtfully. You could. Don't forget she is my wife, I interjected. I don't want to stoop to her level. Kevin thought for a minute, and then his face lit up. Oh, how about we pull a doppelganger prank? What's that? Well, I'll sit on the couch and pretend to be you, and once she comes home and starts talking to me, you'll call her from the other room. He seemed delighted with his own idea. That's sure to freak her out. Granted, Kevin and I did look somewhat alike, at least from the back, that is. We had the same haircut and a similar body type. I wasn't sure if a prank like this would stop Christy from pursuing me further or the opposite. Encourage her to continue, but it was worth a shot. I rummaged through my closet and found some clothes for Kevin to wear. I gave him a hoodie just in case Christy was too familiar with the back of my head. As it drew closer to 5, I left Kevin in front of the TV in the living room and hid behind our bedroom door to wait for my wife. Our room was at the end of a long corridor, making it easy to see the front door if I peeked around the corner. Too late, I'd realized I had left my phone in the kitchen. I considered running to get it, but Christy was due home any minute and I didn't want to ruin the surprise. I'm not sure how long I stood there. I didn't have any means of checking the time, so minutes dragged on while I waited for the sound of footsteps on the stairwell. I froze as I heard the key sliding into the lock. There hadn't been any indication whatsoever that anyone was behind the door. She seemed to be taking her time, twisting the key in the lock slowly and diligently. The anticipation was sending shivers down my spine. It sounded like she was trying to break into the apartment. Was the lock broken? Why was it taking her so long to unlock the door? And then it hit me. She was trying to be quiet. The hallway was silent. It seemed like minutes had ticked by without so much as a single sound. Why wasn't she opening the door? I peeked around the corner and my heart dropped. The front door was ajar and my wife was already standing in the hall. She was facing away from me, carefully pulling the door shut. I wondered if Kevin could hear her from the living room. I watched her as she placed her things down gingerly on the floor and then straightened up. For a minute she stood motionless, her eyes shut and lips pursed. She looked like she was taking deep breaths. Then she slowly got down on all fours like a spider waiting to pounce. What was she doing? Was she trying to sneak up on me? If she was planning her own prank, our plan wouldn't work, I thought. At least Kevin would surely believe me after this. Christy had begun crawling across the floor towards the living room. She moved slowly and awkwardly, almost like an animated character. In any other circumstances, I would have found the sight comical, but back then, I was terrified. I watched until Christy disappeared out of sight and braced myself for a loud boo. But it didn't come. I waited for a gasp, a cry, anything, but the apartment was silent. I could have sworn at least 3 minutes had passed after Christy had turned the corner. A chill crawled up my spine. Where was she? What was she doing? The TV was still blaring and I wondered if I had simply missed it. I didn't want to leave the safety of my hiding place, and I had to go check in on my friend. I took a deep breath and tiptoed down the corridor, my pulse picking up and making me lightheaded. Why on earth was I getting so riled up? It was only my wife, for God's sake. I reached the living room just as the home team scored and peeked through the crack in the door. Kevin was still sitting on the couch facing the TV. So, where was Christy? I scanned the room, but there was no sign of her. Had she gone to the kitchen? My stomach lurched at the thought. Without so much as a glance, I hurtled into the living room and slammed the door shut behind me. I wasn't going to risk being scared to death if she had. It didn't work, man. She's in the kitchen, I stammered, holding my living room door shut with the weight of my body, half expecting my wife to come barging in. Help me hold the door. The figure in the hoodie shifted, revealing a strand of golden hair. Sure, honey, I'll come help. And that's when I noticed the blood. I decided to get a dog when I moved away from my family to go to my dream college. It was my first time living on my own, and I figured it would be easier with a pet. I've always loved dogs and can't remember a time where there wasn't at least 3 of them in my home growing up. I know how to train them and care for them, so I figured it wouldn't be such a big deal having just one on my own. I got him from a shelter and named him Thor, after my favorite Marvel hero. He looked young and healthy, but the vets couldn't identify the dog's exact age. He had apparently been at the shelter for a couple years. Most people wouldn't have wanted him, but I had a soft spot for unwanted dogs, and the sad look in his eyes made me want to get him out of there. He was an amazing dog, listened to everything I said, and hardly needed any training. It felt like he actually understood every word I spoke to him. Unfortunately, he never caught on to the name Thor, and I would only listen to commands like, "Come here, buddy," or "Go fetch, pal." Also, that sad look in his eyes never faded. I noticed it a few weeks after getting him, how desperate his eyes really looked. Staring into his eyes felt like he was piercing your soul, like I was looking into the eyes of a loved one on their deathbed. I could feel his gaze before I even knew he was in the room. It got to the point where I would avoid the dog as much as I could while still caring for him, and slept with the door locked. After about 6 months of this, I decided I needed a roommate to ease the tension. I made a post online and got quite a few replies since the place was reasonably priced and nice. I had a few of them come over one at a time, but they all backed down. It was only when one guy mentioned it that I realized it was because of the dog. Why is he looking at me like that? Oh, the dog? Yeah, I was stunned into silence as I glanced at the dog and noticed that the sad look he held for so long was now a burning anger. Not only that, but you could feel the bloodlust. It was extremely abnormal for any dog to look like this. Being around dogs for my whole life, I knew what a dog looked like when it was ready to attack or feel threatened. They would show their teeth, start a low rumbling growl, and take a stance ready to leap on its prey. But Thor didn't do any of these. In fact, if you took a picture, he might have looked like a normal dog, but the look in his eyes was haunting, like a deranged killer looking at a victim. The guy obviously left, and when I looked back at Thor, his eyes had returned to their saddened state. The only reason I didn't get rid of him right then and there was because he had never done anything wrong. He behaved perfectly fine, never attacked a single one of the guests I had over, and ultimately didn't deserve to be abandoned. But still, his eyes haunted me. I decided to continue looking for a roommate. One after the other would come over with high hopes and leave frightened. It all changed when one girl named Vanessa came by. I was always worried about having a female roommate since I had a long-distance girlfriend back home who I loved very much. When she came by, she was really nice and quite attractive. So I was quick to introduce her to Thor, as my girlfriend would get very jealous. But when I called him over, his face filled with joy as he saw her. His eyes looked happy, and he even seemed to smile as he ran over and jumped on her, licking her face and panting. This would have made me feel happy or relieved, but I couldn't shake this uneasy feeling. After a lot of convincing and swearing to stay loyal to my girlfriend, Vanessa finally moved in with me. I was relieved to finally have someone other than Thor in the house, especially since she agreed to help with taking care of him. The two of them got together so well. He had always been a good listener, but he actually showed emotion around Vanessa. He would run enthusiastically when she called him, smile and wag his tail when she pat him. It was like he turned into a whole new dog. He even slept in the same room as her and would sometimes cuddle up in bed with her. But I saw something sinister in his eyes. Even though he looked happy, it was like he couldn't fully mask his true feelings. This arrangement continued for a year, until one night when things changed. It was 2 a.m. I was at the dining room table studying for an exam I had the next morning, when Vanessa came out of her room and sat across from me. "Does Thor ever creep you out?" I was sort of taken aback. Didn't she love Thor? She was the only one he acted normal around. Well, yeah, actually. That's why I got a roommate. I couldn't stand the look in his eyes. He gave me this awful feeling. She sort of nodded in agreement, which was unexpected. Yeah, I find it hard to look at him sometimes. He always seems so happy, but his eyes scare me. Like, I know it sounds crazy, but sometimes he looks like he wants to hurt me. It's like some deranged man who is happy he's found his victim. I sat back and can't seem to get any words out. It was relieving and terrifying that someone else felt the same way as I do. After a minute of silence, I finally spoke. "Yeah, I know what you mean. He kind of has this..." I stop in my tracks as I notice this terrifying look in her face. I look behind me and see Thor standing in the hallway, giving us that haunting look, bloodlust oozing off of him. "Thor, go to bed," I say with a shaky voice, terrified of what he could do. He just stands there, as still as a rock, locking his gaze with mine. I feel this sharp pain rush through my body as we lock eyes. I can't move. He starts to walk towards us slowly. Vanessa lets out a light scream before I hear the clap of her hands quickly covering her mouth. Our eyes stay locked until he walks right past me. All of a sudden, everything turns dark. I wake up next to Vanessa completely naked beside me. I jolt up in a panic, trying to remember what happened the night before. My heart fills with anxiety knowing I must have made a terrible mistake. I suddenly remember Thor and what happened last night. Was that a dream? Did he attack Vanessa? Why is she lying beside me naked? My mind spun with questions I didn't have the answer to. Vanessa woke up, rolled over, and looked at me with a smile. "Last night was fun, but I think it's time we parted ways, buddy. I'm finally free." I stood there confused. Her eyes were different. They were bright green yesterday and full of joy. Now all I see are these dark, menacing eyes. She stands up in a terribly awkward way and struggles to put her clothes on. She tries walking across the room but stumbles multiple times, as if she couldn't remember how to work her own body. "You aren't Vanessa, are you?" She spoke while looking away from me. "You know Thor is a really stupid name for a dog, right? I never really liked it much, so I think you should name her something else. You know, something someone wouldn't mind being called for a while." "What are you talking about?" She finally turns her head and gives me a smile, this unshakable feeling of terror running through me. "I'll be seeing you soon, pal." As she walked away, I saw Thor, sitting in front of the door with that sad look again. But the look didn't creep me out like it did before. It was like the day I saw him at the shelter. I felt bad for him again. I slowly walked closer to him and felt my heart sink as I looked into his bright green eyes filled with tears. "Vanessa?" My mother died about 3 hours ago. She was on her way home from work when she was struck by a car in a hit and run. My father was friends with the local police chief, who called him as soon as he had a visual confirmation my mother was dead. My father decided it would be best if I was left here at the house while he went on to confirm what had happened. Let me say, sitting alone at home, waiting for my mother to come home, knowing she never would again, probably not the best way to leave your child. Grief does work in mysterious ways, and my father was likely attempting to protect me from seeing what would likely have fed my nightmares. Sitting in the living room, I decided that sitting in silence wasn't going to be doing me any favors. I turned on the TV and started watching one of those generic superhero movies. You know the ones, filled with unnecessary jokes, overly drawn-out action sequences. Those types of films. The perfect distraction, I thought. Something to take my mind off. I heard a chime on my phone. Opening it up, I saw a text sent from an unknown number. Assuming my father had just left his phone at home, he was prone to do that, I opened it up expecting to see a text letting me know he'd be home soon with news. However, instead, I was greeted with a picture message. Puzzled, I downloaded the picture and was greeted with a picture of my mom. She was facing away from the camera, standing on the sidewalk, seemingly walking towards the neighboring parking garage from her work. The image was zoomed in on her, but I could just make out the edges of a vehicle's inspection tags in one of the upper corners. I was confused, thinking that maybe it was my dad texting me to let me know my mother was okay, and he was just pulling up to pick her up when I received another picture from the same number. This time, I nearly passed out in fear. On the ground lay my mother, her arm bent at a weird angle, with red blood pouring from a gash in her skull. Her hair was matted and sticky with the liquid. Her shirt was torn. If she wasn't dead when it was taken, she would have been soon. I had received confirmation that my mother was dead in the worst way possible, by seeing her from the killer's point of view. I immediately went to dial 911 when a third text chimed. On the screen I saw it was an actual text. All it said was, "Hello, Henry." A moment later, my door opened and my father returned home, his face gaunt. I told him what I had received, nearly yelling in anger and fright, questioning him why he had sent me the pictures. He replied that he had his phone the entire time, proving it by pulling it out and showing it to me. I responded by showing him the pictures sent to me. He took my phone and immediately called his friend, the police chief, to send an officer out to us. I was in hysterics and decided to retire to my room, having had quite enough of the pain the emotions brought. Laying there in bed crying, I heard a voice say, "Hello, Henry. Is your mama home?" Frightened, I looked around my room and couldn't find the source of the voice. Thinking back on it, the voice had sounded a little bit garbly, almost like it was a phone on speaker or playing through a Bluetooth speaker. I turned to look at my radio. Sure enough, the light was green. It was connected to something. I quickly stood and went to turn it off, but then, "If you turn off the speaker, I will break into your house and kill you." I was frozen in place. Fear welled up in my chest as I waited. Unsure how to proceed, the voice returned. "Good. Sit back down on your bed." I did as I was told. I looked at the door to my room, hoping to find my father would hear what was happening. No such luck. "Do you want to play a game?" "No," I replied. "Leave me alone." "I'm afraid I can't do that, Henry. We're going to play a game of hide and seek. In about 3 minutes, I'm going to find you and kill you. If you aren't hiding in a safe spot, then I will kill you and your father. Time's wasting. Better hurry." The Bluetooth speaker began counting down. I ran from my room and went looking for my father. I couldn't find him anywhere. Knowing I was running out of time, I quickly grabbed a knife and went into the bathroom upstairs. I hid in the shower, having locked the door. I heard the chime of my Bluetooth speaker begin counting down. I ran from my room and went looking for my father. I couldn't find him anywhere. Knowing I was running out of time, I quickly grabbed a knife and went into the bathroom upstairs. I hid in the shower, having locked the door. I heard the chime of my Bluetooth speaker going off. For 2 minutes, it played repeatedly. I heard my father walk into my room to turn it off, but I also heard the telling creak of the hardwood floor just outside my bathroom. Someone else was in the house with me and my dad. My dad called out my name, but by then, the door to the bathroom had swung open, and standing in the silhouette was a tall man in a dark outfit, mask and all. "Hello, Henry," he said. He walked into the bathroom and smiled. I was too scared to make a noise. He had me trapped. I knew I could have called out for my dad to help, but the only sound out of my lips was a frightened gasp as the man walked forward still. He was a foot away from me, a knife in his hand, and was savoring the moment. My dad walked up and saw him standing there. He lunged for the man and knocked the knife from his hands, struggling with him on the bathroom floor. I quickly grabbed the knife and watched in absolute horror as my father struggled with the man before he fell unconscious. My father helped me out of the shower and immediately called the cops. Within minutes, an officer ran up the stairs and handcuffed the man before he regained consciousness. A short time later, the police chief arrived with several more officers, all there to take the man into custody. On the man, they found my mother's ID and phone, as well as another phone which he had used to send me the pictures. During the investigation, it came out that the man was a widowed father of a young boy my mother had failed to save during a cardiac arrest the year prior. The man who had spent the last year plotting his revenge had seen my mother walking away from the hospital she'd worked at and had run her down. Having realized killing her wasn't enough, he wanted my father to feel the same pain he had gone through, having lost both a wife and a son. The man was taken away and jailed. To this day, 2 words still haunt my every nightmare. Hello, Henry. Hi, so 4 months ago, my little brother B and his friend went missing. We still haven't found them yet, but I found one of my brother's notebooks and the things he wrote in it might explain his disappearance. I typed up what was written in the notebook before giving it to the police. I'm hoping that you guys might be able to help me find my brother and his friends. Please. My mom is heartbroken and my little sister Isabel was inseparable from him. If anyone has any information about what might have happened to them, please let me know. 12/30/2021. Hi. My therapist said to try journaling to help with my anxiety, so here we go, I guess. There's been some strange things happening. I've been seeing something outside my window and I keep hearing things in the woods. I can't quite describe the sounds I hear, but they sound almost like skittering in the bushes and faint, distorted voices. The thing I see, though, it scares me. It sounds kind of like a deer, but its face is messed up. It's almost like it's been stretched out and bent, kind of like Tapir's face almost. But it doesn't have eyes and its neck is weirdly shaped. It's longer than it should be and it has several odd bends in it, almost like it's been broken several times. Now, I should be telling this to my therapist, but I'm worried that I might have to go back to the mental hospital if I do. I've already been there once for trying to overdose, and it was awful. They treated us horribly and threatened to hurt us if we did something they didn't like. Now, I know that if my mom knew about how I was treated there, she'd do everything she could to make sure that I didn't go back. But I live in Florida, where I can be Baker's acted. So, none of us really have a choice if they decide to send me back. Anyway, my friends are coming for a sleepover. I gotta go. 12/31/2021. Oh my god. Oh my fucking god. It was really there. The deer thing I kept seeing. I thought it was just my imagination for some sort of hallucination, but it was really there. Me and my friends, Michael, Nikki, Arlo, and Rose were just fooling around. We decided to go look around in the woods beside our house. It's not that big, so we weren't worried about getting lost. My older sibling tried to talk us out of it, saying that we'd get in trouble and we could get hurt. We told her that we wouldn't do it, but we waited for her and my mom to go to sleep. There was my little sister, but she was busy playing Minecraft in her room. I don't know how we ended up where we were. We were following a small animal trail that was in the woods. Somehow we ended up at a bridge. This didn't really make sense because the only bridge near our house was about a mile away, and it didn't have any doors under it. We figured we had just wandered a bit further than usual and figured that we'd just never seen it before. After all, it wasn't that big of a bridge. It barely had any water under it, just a few puddles here and there, and the ground was covered in cement. Kind of like those man-made canals you sometimes see. We saw the doors and decided to go see what was on the other side of them. God, if we had just gone home or listened to my sister, this never would have happened. It all went to shit once we opened those doors. We placed a big rock we'd found in the doorway so it didn't close on us. We had our phones, so if we did get stuck somehow, we could call for help. Once we got inside, though, the door slammed shut. "What the hell?" Arlo yelled. "We just put a rock there. How the fuck did it close?" "I don't know," Nikki said, trying to open the door. "Damn it, it's locked," she said. "What? How?" "I'll go ahead and call my mom." I spoke, a little spooked, although I figured she was just messing around. When she picked up, however, there was this staticky screeching sound. "The fuck was that?" Rose said. "I don't know, probably just my little sister playing a prank though," I said, sighing. "I'll call Mom again." Before I could do that, however, Michael spoke up. "Hey guys, what's that outside?" When I looked out the small, grated window and saw what she was talking about, I froze in terror. Guys, are you seeing the weird deer thing that I'm seeing?" I asked, my voice trembling. Yeah," Arlo said. "What the fuck is that?" "I'm not sure, but I've seen it a few times at night before," I whispered. Suddenly the thing rammed the door. Nikki screeched and Michael yelled, "Get back!" That thing's face was pressed against the window from the outside, growling loudly. I frantically tried to call my mom again, but she didn't pick up. Come on," I yelled, trying again. Just then, Arlo screamed. The thing was squeezing through the window. What the hell?" he was yelling. It shouldn't even be able to fit through. That window was only a 6-inch by 6-inch space. I ran to the door, finding it unlocked, but it was stuck. I managed to pull it open and we ran. Michelle screamed. I looked back to see it rip her in half. Before I was able to run back, Nikki grabbed my arms and dragged me along while the thing started chasing us. It was clearly faster than we were, but it was trying to stay behind us, toying with us. It bit Nikki by the leg, dragging her back. Rose tried to pull her away from it, but it just rammed its head into her, knocking her out. "Run!" Arlo was screaming. We ran and he could hear it panting behind us. We saw house lights, and when we broke away from the tree line, we were only a few houses away from my house. My legs were killing me. Even though he hadn't run that far, it felt like we'd been running forever. We were running up the driveway, though, pulling the front door open and slamming it shut. I quickly locked it, and we bolted to my sister's room, screaming and waking her up. "What's wrong?" she asked. Me and Arlo were telling her what happened, tripping over each other's words, almost too out of breath to speak. She went and got Mom, and they called the police. It's been a week, and they still haven't found Nikki, Rose, or Michelle. 1/21/2022. It's been 3 weeks, and Arlo didn't make it home from school. I tried telling the cops what I saw that night, and that I think the thing got Arlo, too. They thought that since it was dark and I was so scared that my mind had made up the creature. I'm scared. I think it's going to come to get me too. I can still hear the voices in the woods. Only now they're closer. And they sound like my friends. Sometimes a monster is your only friend. I found it endlessly annoying how they kept trying to personify addiction as a monster. The rehabs, the halfway houses, AA, NA, everyone in recovery desperately trying to frame pain as anything more than it was. Addiction rips up your soul, feasts on your flesh, drains your life force, and infects the world around you. I found that wildly unfair to monsters. Sometimes monsters protect you. It was 2006 and I loathed Florida. I was stuck in a grimy, rundown halfway house in a shitty neighborhood in the Sunshine State. The shit-stained state. My roommate Devin, who rarely spoke, called it. I was far from home and had been in 3 consecutive rehabs. Now I was stuck in this hellhole run by drugged-out Common because it was cheap. And I had nowhere else to turn to. So far from home, a year clean. 4 of us lived in a rundown shack in a cul-de-sac abutting a train track. The litter and graffiti were only offset by the majesty of the track not 10 feet from us. Surrounded by a small, decrepit forest. I didn't think much of it at that time. Why were the trees dying? It was nothing but rain and sunshine. Rain and sunshine. Rain and sunshine. I was concerned with minutia, or really anything outside my own predicament. Every thought was consumed with figuring out a way to get home. Maybe I should have been concerned. Devin and I got along really well, but Chucky and Bobby hated me. They were 2 Boston meatheads recently paroled after a 10-year bid for cocaine trafficking. Aggressive psychopaths who worked as bellhops by day and shot steroids into each other's asses by night. They were pure ID. It's not like anyone drug tested us or bothered to check in on us. They just took what little money we had. It was my mouth they hated from the get-go. I ran it recklessly. Chucky and Bobby could hardly stand the sight of me. The days progressively turned sour, the air feeling a little more electric with the tension of implied threats and cold glares, which invariably warped into castrations and outright violence. I remember the first time I saw it, I was absolutely convinced my housemates had slipped me some hallucinogen that I had to be tripping balls. I didn't want to be near Chucky or Bobby, so I was walking the train track, trying to avoid the used needles and loose nails when I saw Slither for the first time. Slither. The name came to me instantly, like it had been buried within the recesses of morbid place in my mind. I wasn't supposed to find. It wasn't creative. Terror doesn't inspire creativity. Fear hands the reins over to your animal brain and the animal brain calls it like it sees it. Slither looked like Salvador Dali had done an absurd amount of LSD and tried to paint a ghostly worm. About 7 feet long, its entire form was bulbous, pulsating, and hairless. A sheer, luminous white, like a fresh paint of coat on the wall of a mental ward covered its body. 2 tiny, beady black eyes protruded from the front, at least a foot separating them. Slither didn't have a mouth, at least not one I could see. 4 legs darted up and down from random points on its torso, angled like a grasshopper's. I honestly don't know what they were for. It didn't walk. It slithered on its belly like a snake, only at far wider and more dramatic angles. I was reminded of how a sidewinder moves, somehow simultaneously rhythmic yet with extreme left and right jerky motions. Slither was impossibly fast. It had to weigh hundreds of pounds yet wiggled like a weightless grub worm flying across the driveway for the safety of the grass. I stood frozen. My brain could not seem to process the speed and silence of its approach. How was gravel not flying anywhere? How was it making no noise? And why did its tiny eyes look so desperate? It felt like God had pushed the mute button on the world while he went to grab some popcorn to really enjoy this creature feature. God. I grew up in the church. I never cared much for religion, and I had trouble swallowing most of the concepts. But I prayed privately. Despite my doubt, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was more to the story than what was in front of the curtain. I figured I was wrong, but it helped me get through the darkness. Getting clean, I found myself praying more and more. No atheists in a foxhole. I just needed to feel like someone was there, in my corner, having my back. Friends and family had disappeared. Intellectual honesty be damned. And I don't mind admitting my brain flashed some jumble prayer before I bolted. I cut through the woods, shredding my arms on random thorny protrusions. I could feel Slither just behind my footfalls, a strange warmth pulsating out of it. I couldn't help it. I had to look back. When I emerged from the woods onto our street, I turned around. Peering through the tree line, I could see Slither had never entered the woods. It had stopped where the tracks met the patch of dying forest. I could just make out its little dark eyes. I expected to see hunger in them, anger, animalism. I couldn't tell you how, but they almost looked desperate, pleading to me. I saw one of our neighbors on his stoop, Chicken Joe. Never introduced himself as Joe. Always Chicken Joe. If you asked about it, he'd ball up a fist, take one step forward, and menacingly tell you not to worry about it. A strange lot for strange times. The gear on his dirty patio table told me he was riding the dragon and feeling comfortably numb. A dirty needle, some cotton, a rubber tube. I didn't care. I dragged him up, muttering some incoherent complaint in his stupor. Chicken, chicken. I slapped him hard. A small shimmer of lucidity spread across his patchy face. Do you see it? I pointed through the trees at Slither, resting on the train tracks, its swollen body heaving up and down. See what, Pappy? The giant fucking white devil worm chicken? He looked at me with pity and said, Man, you need to cut back on them drugs. I rolled my eyes and slunk back to my house, looking over my shoulder the entire time. I worked late the next day and Bobby was in a roid rage when I returned home, screaming about me leaving a plate out too long, Devin freaking him out with his silence, someone stealing his protein bars, anything his addled mind could hold on to. That was my cue. Exit stage left, pursued by a hulking junkie. I crept through the woods silently, taking care to not add to the myriad of scratches running up and down my bare arms. The Florida sun drenched my face, the air so thick with humidity you could slice it up and spread it on bread. I had to know. I did my best to tiptoe to the train tracks, which, each crunch of gravel under my feet, I winced, expecting some pale hell worm to come ripping towards me at breakneck speed. Nothing. I stood there silently, noticing the trees and seemed to die a little overnight, each branch sagging and browning. It had rained last night, but this patchwork forest looked starved. The explosion of motion in my periphery set off alarm bells in a primal place, like a prehistoric hunter sensing predatory eyes in the deep dark. I was entranced for a moment by just how pronounced its slither was. Its tail end whipped so far left and right you'd expect its bones, if it had any, to just snap. That dance would continue up its body, a mesmerizing, flailing motion, the horrible wriggle of a demon earthworm. This time, I was off the block a lot quicker, plunging through the forest, feeling thorns mutilate my skin. I stopped at the edge of a cul-de-sac, hands on my knees, panting and staring through the trees. Slither sat, its body heaving at the edge of the woods just on the tracks. Its eyes bore holes into me, This time, I felt like they were begging me. At first, I thought it was hungry, and I was a meal that just kept tempting it. But there was something else there, like a toddler who needed to relay an emergency. All the franticness of emotion, but none of the necessary language. What the fuck are you doing? Take stupidity, add redundancy, which meant Chucky was behind me, looking at this fucked up monster on the track. I pointed to where Slither rested. There's nothing there. Give me $20. I looked at Chucky, twice my size, eyes and arms bulging like a bad Batman villain. No. Chucky slammed me in the stomach. I doubled over, vomiting what little food I'd been able to afford to eat that day. Your days are numbered. You and that mouth. Chucky walked off. The days ran away and I settled into a disturbing routine. I found work and food when I could, but most days I crept on the tracks, trying to silent, hoping to watch Slither, only to find myself the victim in hot pursuit until I cleared the tracks. Each day, the abuse got worse. I'd catch a beating for leaving my laundry in the dryer. They'd punch holes in the drywall because I left some hairs on the bathroom sink. Every retort I couldn't help resulted in a bloody lip or nose. Day by day, the small forest took on a darker hue, its collective life decaying, heading to rot. The neighborhood took to calming me. Schizoid. Every person I showed couldn't see Slither, who would rest at the edge of the forest watching me, trying to tell me something with its eyes in a language I just didn't understand. I prayed to a god I didn't believe in, who wasn't listening to me to get out of here, away from the monsters. A bottle of soda was my undoing. I had grabbed one out of the fridge late one night, not realizing it was pressurized. When I opened it, a torrential storm of dark brown liquid exploded, covering our ramshackle living room. Nicotine-stained walls, hanging cupboards, broken tile, all soaked. I was contemplating my fate when Bobby and Chucky walked in. My heart iced over as I realized their work shifts were sitting on a few chairs nearby. They were covered in brown stains. I could barely decipher their gorilla screams. No sense appealing to compassion or offering to remedy the situation. When the body says run, I'd learned, you run. So, I ran. Through the dead trees, too resigned and devoid of life to even tear at my arms. I was much smaller and faster, and I thought that gave me an edge. I was wrong. You can't outright the hatred of a bull. You can't outrun the madness of steroids. Just as I hit the track, they caught up with me. They took turns viciously beating me. The first few strikes hurt like hell. After that, shock set in, my body going limp. I realized we'd long passed the usual abuse, that this was likely my final curtain call. As my swollen eyes lost their field of vision, I could see blood spraying from my nose, taste the copper of it in my mouth, hear bones crunching. I don't know how long it went on. I don't know how I wasn't already dead when my body crumpled onto the tracks. I saw them, just barely staring over me, the embers of unaltered rage burning in their eyes, gleeful smiles etched on their face. Two monsters, delighting in their wicked work. From some distant corner of my mind, I called out to God one last time. All I wanted to do was get clean and go home, even if I deserved this. Mercy. Please, mercy. Send me an angel. It felt stupid and out of character, but at the edge of death, you lose all sense of self and go for broke. The last thing I saw before the infinite warmth of unconsciousness took me was Slither, the pale worm, effortlessly gliding towards me, its meal, the feast finally ready. I came to in the hospital 3 days later. I had more injuries than I could count. Concussions, broken this, shattered that. They'd caught the internal bleeding just in time. The police took my statement. Apparently Chicken Joe saw Bobby and Chucky chasing me, emerging from the woods without me, covered in blood. He found me and got help. Even us junkies do the right thing. A detective asked me if I knew what happened to Bobby and Chucky after they beat me. I could only speak in painful rasps, but I told her that they must have made a run for it. Didn't want to go back to prison and all that. The detective's eyes shifted uncomfortably, and she showed me a picture. Next to the pool of blood where my body had lain was a sight I'll never forget. 2 pairs of boots, perfectly upright, not a drop of blood on them, which was strange given that a leg jutted from each boot, cleanly severed just below the knee. I was at a loss for words. I was ruled out, given that I was an inch from death when they found me. Our neighbors confirmed to the police that Chicken Joe never entered the woods. They never figured out what happened to Chucky and Bobby. I did. It took a few months of healing to get back there, but the moment I could, I returned to the cul-de-sac. The decrepit forest was bursting with green life, as if the magic of spring had found it again in one fell swoop. I carefully cut through the trees and found the track, stood, and waited. Slither came tearing down the track with its haunting wiggle, hurtling towards me. I never moved. No more running. A foot away, our eyes met. I can't really explain how, but I saw love there. I was startled when I heard the whispers. They were faint and sprang from every tree. 1,000 voices, all the same, melodic but discordant, far away. Hello, Pappy. My hands trembled, but I steeled my nerves. Hello? Did you eat them? Bobby and Chucky? Slither cocked its head slightly. I did not know monsters had names, but yes, I ate them. I ate them for what they did to you, my child. The compassion in the thousands of voices was palpable. Thank you, I muttered quietly, gratefully looking in its eyes, crying a little. Yeah, you're here to protect me, aren't you? I'm sorry I ran away. Yes, he does not always send pretty angels. Sometimes he sends me. I walked over and gently touched its head, holding my hand steady, feeling the warmth of my guardian. I can never thank you enough. What's your name? You call me Slither. I like that. Slither. They're still slithering inside me right now, you know, for what they did to my child. My eyes grew to saucers as Slither raised its face level with mine. Where nothing once was, a small mouth appeared and grew. Its maw opened, showing what had to be at least 10,000 rows of teeth, swelling and expanding until I could see deep into Slither's body. That's when I saw them. Chucky and Bobby, fumbling, twitching, scrambling, reaching from inside Slither's bulbous belly. They screamed and begged and pleaded for help, cried out to me and God and their mothers. None of us were listening. Slither closed its mouth until nothing was left on its face but its obsidian eyes and silence. We stood there among the lush trees, and I felt life in my body again. I'm going back to Texas, Slither. Will you come with me? Slither cocked its head, and I could sense a smile that wasn't there. Of course, Pappy. Just make sure to live by a train track. Emma was murdered in the early hours of the morning, following a night out on the town celebrating her 18th birthday. The police questioned the 3 of us, Julie, Lexi, and me, for hours separately. Together, they took our phones and then returned them. Eventually, they had to release us. Our stories, our phones, forensic analysis, everything all checked out. There was no way they could link us to Emma's death, although God knows they tried. We backed each other up, and most important of all, we were innocent. We had absolutely nothing to do with Emma's murder. In fact, I tried to help her, and only got a blow to the head as a result. The police were particularly interested in that, but I stuck to my story that I tripped and bashed my head on the way home from the club. Yes, we lied to the police. We said we weren't with her when she was murdered, and we didn't know who murdered her. We were, and we did. It was around 5 a.m. when it happened. We were huddled around our phones in Emma's room, hotly debating which ones should be posted on social media. Some pictures had already gone up during our course of the night, and we didn't delete those, blurry and poorly lit, but we deleted everything else before the police picked us up. The photos spanned the night, from the early hours when we were first getting ready in Emma's room, with reams of bright makeup and discarded glittery clothes forming the background. Then we had hit the streets, brightly lit under the lamps. The downtown ablaze with neon, the lineup to the club, the people, the crowds, and then the club itself. Lights, faces, sparkles, cocktails, dancers, the DJ, the costumes. We were making funny faces holding up V signs with our color-tipped fingers and all the other sorts of odd gestures, thinking we were so cool. Our lipsticked glossy red and orange mouths pulled in different expressions. Our eyes ringed with black and arched with silver and gold and glittery green. Wide open, uncrinkling from laughter. Our hair immaculate and smooth at first. Frizzy and rough towards the end. There were even photos from the club washrooms. A drunkenly hilarious idea at the time. "Who's that?" Lexi pointed to a shadowy figure in one of the first photos, taken from when we were still in Emma's room getting ready. Our excited chatter about which photo to post died down as well as we all leaned in closer, squinting. It could have just been an odd juxtaposition of hanging clothes, the corners, and shadow, but it did look like a human silhouette was in the background, leaning slightly forward towards the four of us who were crowding around the dressing room table and closet. We swiped on, then I spotted it. "Is this the same guy?" I blurted out before realizing what I said. It was a brightly lit photo of us out on the streets. The streetlights lit up the scene. It was only the four of us in this selfie. Lexi holding her phone up high, and this time the figure of a guy standing quite close and behind us could be seen clearly. His head tilted forward so his face was partially shadowed but not completely dark. We fell silent. I couldn't help looking up, my eyes sweeping the corners of the room, and I noticed the other girls do the same, while also averting our glances from each other. Everything seemed ordinary, but also not. Nobody answered my question. We kept swiping in dead silence. We were no longer analyzing our faces and bodies for the most social media friendly poses, but looking in the shadows and corners of each photo. "Emma, it looks like... is it... Jack?" Julie finally asked what we had all been thinking from the very first photo. "I'm sorry, but it does. It looks like him." She cried, her voice rising. "Don't be crazy. He's been dead for years," snapped Emma. Jack was Emma's boyfriend from 4 years ago. He had killed himself. The police had found Emma's texts from the days before his suicide on his phone, telling him multiple times to KYS. She had been investigated at the time, but she had been only 14 then and no charges were laid. She had said she didn't realize he would actually do it, but later said she wanted to see if he would or not. She had been sent to mandatory therapy for weeks and emerged much the same as she always had been. "Look at this." Julie showed us a picture on her phone of the club lineup just as we were entering the club. There was a mass of people crowded behind us and around us. The club lights were shining on our faces. Amongst them, the figure of the guy with the face who looked like Jack was visible. Lexi said, Well, if it's not Jack, it sure looks like him. You bitches have been watching too many horror movies with your loser boyfriends, cried out Emma. This guy must be some nut job stalking you. My shriek of terror cut her off. Wordlessly, I showed a photo on my phone. It was one of the last ones of the night, in the club washroom. The four of us had gone in together, and at that moment, no one else other than us had been in the washroom. Julie and Lexi had vanished, giggling and laughing into the stalls, while Emma rummaged in her purse. I lifted my phone and snapped a picture of her as she leaned into the mirror. The boy who looked like Jack was standing quite close behind Emma. She was putting on lipstick, fiercely concentrating on her image in the mirror. His face was clear in the mirror, although Emma and I were oblivious to his presence at that time. There was no mistaking Jack's face in the picture on my phone. Emma buried her face in her hands. "Why now, Emma?" asked Julie quietly. Emma shrugged. Lexi answered for her. She's an adult now. She has to pay for what she did. Then Emma's head snapped back and she started making choking sounds, scrabbling at her neck, her eyes bulging horribly. Julie and I screamed while Lexi held up her phone and started recording. We craned in, and on her camera, the figure of Jack strangling the life out of Emma was clearly visible. Instinctively, I reached out and tried to pry his fingers loose from around Emma's neck. And for one terrible split second, I saw his face outside the camera as he turned to me, snarling, his eyes burning deep into mine. As he pushed me away, I felt his ice-cold touch. I staggered and fell back. When I came to, Emma was dead. I don't like talking about this much. It still gives me the creeps, but I have to tell someone. Maybe then I can get some sleep. I drive maybe 3 or 4 hours a day for work. I know it's a lot, but I loved my job, and I didn't mind the commute until... Anyway, like many of you, I listened to the radio to keep me sane during the commute. Mostly top 40s or the local rock stations. Anything with a little kick to keep me awake and focused on the drive. About 4 months into this job, I noticed the radio would go dead silent as I passed through one town. It was this little nowhere town I had to cut through because taking the highway would have added another hour onto my already exhausting commute. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it's just hard to get a radio signal way out in this little rural place. A month went by, and the same radio silence hit every time I passed through that town. I only paid attention because the radio cut out suddenly. Just past the welcome sign, I'd be driving, singing along to some song, and then silence. Like the radio itself stopped working. The silence allowed me to look around more as I drove around through the town. Not many people were outside, which I thought was odd, but then again, I assumed this was a tight-knit community, and they probably didn't like seeing a stranger roll through their town at weird hours. And in fact, I drove through the town for 6 straight months before ever seeing a living soul. Then one night, as I was making my way back from work, I turned into the town past the welcome sign and up the main road. This time felt different. There was a stillness like I had never felt before. The silence was deafening. There were no birds or crickets, no dogs barking, nothing. I passed by some kids playing on the sidewalk. They were dressed like any regular school kids would be. They had chalk, and one of them seemed to be drawing out a hopscotch game. I hadn't seen any of the townsfolk up close before, so as I drove by, I rolled down my window to say hello. They looked up, or at least their heads turned to look at me. As I gazed over their faces, my blood ran cold. They didn't have eyes. Only empty, bleeding sockets where their eyes should have been. I didn't even feel my foot press the gas. I turned around and sped out of that town as fast as my car would allow. I don't remember stopping at any red lights as I raced for the safety of my home. When I got home, I called my boss and told him I could no longer make the commute. He seemed saddened, but he understood and told me to take care. I haven't slept in 3 days. Every time I close my eyes, I see them, those kids, and their bleeding stares. The first time my daughter Nancy saw the doll, it was love at first sight. I thought the thing was a hideous monstrosity. We were on vacation in upstate New York, just south of the Adirondacks, and antique shops were plentiful in the small, quaint towns of the northeast American woods. On the drive up to our cabin, we'd stop by each shop, and we'd see our fair share of old contraptions. Stamps, pictures, statues, but the doll was something we had never seen before. The shopkeeper indicated it was one of a kind, an antique German papier-mâché Muller Strasburger doll, standing tall at 2.5 feet against a support stand. The doll appeared as a young boy with curly blonde hair, but was adorned in a flowing white blouse and blue dress. The head, neck, and shoulders were made of a seamless papier-mâché layer, then another section for the forearms to hands. While the torso and certain joints like the hip, knees, and elbows were filled with stuffing, allowing you to manipulate the doll into a sitting position, or put its hands on its lap. Do yourself a favor and do not Google this type of doll if you're alone right now. So, I knew I was done for when my daughter ran to the doll and exclaimed, "Your name is Georgie. We're going to be best friends forever." The thing is, I had promised Nancy she could pick out one toy on this trip, and I tried to posture that we couldn't fit the doll in the car. That it was too expensive, $300. But immediately the shopkeeper swept in. "Once a girl and a doll are matched, there is no undoing that bond," he said with a knowing smile. "Sorry, but $300 is a bit too steep. Like I said, there's no undoing the bond, and I won't get in the way of that. How about $100? I shook my head. Still too much. It was made in the 19th century. You could easily resell it for $200. No, thank you. Okay, Nancy, we gotta get going. I'll settle for $60. I'll even load it into the car for you. As hideous as that thing was, I couldn't say no to the eager expression my daughter made at that low offer. At my daughter's request, the shopkeeper loaded Georgie the doll into the passenger seat next to her and clipped the seatbelt. Just drive carefully. Georgie is fragile, said the shopkeeper as we departed, giving a final knock on the window as Nancy waved. What ensued in the car was 2 hours of my precious daughter carrying a one-sided conversation with her new best friend forever, Georgie. All the while, I'd peer back at them in the rearview mirror, shuddering any time I made contact with those lifeless papier-mâché eyes. At the log cabin I had rented for the weekend with a beautiful lake view, Nancy wanted nothing more than to have a tea party with Georgie, so I reluctantly took the doll out of the back seat and held it out at arm's length, bringing it to the room. At 2.5 feet, its gangly legs swayed with each of my steps, and I plopped it on the floor in a sitting position. I could have sworn I heard a grunt when I picked the thing up, but then again, I'm 40 and I grunt from getting up from a chair. So, I spent the evening having a tea party with Nancy and Georgie, and let me tell you, my daughter had a blast. I tried my best not to look at Georgie, as even a glimpse of this papier-mâché thing sent a shiver down my spine. But of course, it was impolite not to look at someone with fancily cheersing teacups, pinkies out. Alright, the crickets were loud and reminded us of our isolation. Nancy insisted Georgie sleep in bed with her, but I convinced her that was a bad idea because of the fragility of the doll, and better it laid on the floor next to her bed. Daddy? Yes, dear? Are there bears in these woods? Oh yes, most certainly. Can bears open doors? Well, I suppose they could. Even locked doors? Not locked doors. Don't you worry. No bears are getting in here, and besides, Georgie and I will protect you. But you said Georgie was so fragile I couldn't even sleep with him. And Daddy, you're strong, but I don't think you can beat up a bear if it's a big one. Right. So, that night I ended up dragging the couch right up against the front door, then stacked chairs on top to keep us safe from the bears. I woke up in the middle of the night to the ragged breathing, and I shot up in my bed immediately. I've heard my daughter congestion before, and this was not it. It almost sounded like a sick, wheezing old man on his deathbed. The problem was that it seemed to be synchronized with my daughter's breathing. So I slowly got out of bed and crept up to Nancy. The wheezing was louder as I got closer. I slowly raised my hand to my daughter's nose and with nimble fingers pinched her nose closed. The raspy breathing continued, but now I could tell it was coming from the side of the bed. I flung the light on and leapt over the bed and the raspy breathing stopped. And there was Georgie, still laying right where I had left him. I was deathly silent then, staring intently at that pale, light peach-colored papier-mâché, and again at those damn lifeless blue eyes, and that stupid, frilly blouse. I moved in closer, ready to rip this thing to shreds if I even saw a flutter of movement. Daddy? Dear God. I must have jumped 5 feet in the air. Daddy, are you okay? There's no bear, right? I was not okay. Yes, I'm okay. It's nothing. Let's go back to sleep. I turned off the lights and lay awake as long as I could, but the raspy breathing never returned. The rest of the trip went well. Of course, we had to take Georgie everywhere we went, and for the next few nights I had to perform the ritual of barricading the door to protect us from the bears. At long last, it was time to go, and we were all packed up. As I pulled away from our cabin, I heard Nancy say bye-bye to our cabin, Georgie. And when I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw the doll was looking out the window. Nancy, did you move the doll's head? Silly Daddy. Georgie can look outside by himself. Oh, yeah, of course. And how's that exactly? Well, because Georgie is alive. Goosebumps overwhelmed me and I looked back at my rearview mirror again. The doll was still motionless, looking out the window. Alive. Yeah, of course. Silly Daddy. As I turned onto the freeway that would get us home, I thought I caught a glimpse of the antique shop owner in a car a few dozen feet behind me. But the vehicle drove on along the local roads and I didn't quite get a good look. By the time we got home, Nancy was asleep, so I unbuckled her and carried her to bed. I looked out the window to the driveway and I saw Georgie's curly blonde hair, face still staring blankly out the window. I briefly considered bringing him in, but without Nancy advocating for him, I simply locked the car doors with my key fob. Nighty-night, Georgie. I awoke to a car alarm and I knew immediately it was mine. I darted out of bed, stumbled down the stairs, and threw open the floodlights to my driveway. I heard a door shut as I got to my front door and I barreled through into the cold night. There sat Georgie, strapped in his seatbelt, staring at me with those fucking blank blue eyes, with the car alarm blaring in suburbia at 2 a.m. in the morning. I pressed the lock button on my key fob and the alarm stopped. After a few circles of my car and nothing but the chilly wind accompanying me, I muttered a curse and went back inside. Was probably just a raccoon or cat that jumped on my car. Probably. The following morning, while I'm making blueberry pancakes, the first thing I get from Nancy when she comes down. Where's Georgie? Oh, he told me he wanted to sleep in the car. Nancy giggled. Silly Daddy. Georgie only talks to me, not you. Oh, really? Yeah, Dad. And what does he say? But she was hooked to the cartoon she had just put on. Does he say he likes blueberry pancakes? When breakfast was ready, and at Nancy's request, I lugged Georgie back into the house and sat it at the table. Nancy gave Georgie a big hug, Apparently he did like pancakes, according to her, so I put a napkin on him as a bib. After breakfast, I went back to whatever adult bullshit I had slated away for the day while Nancy played school teacher with Georgie as the student. That night, Nancy wanted me to prop Georgie up in his stand so he could stand around with her as she did her exercises, dancing to Kids Bop on YouTube. God damn, did this doll look even creepier in a standing position. I made a mental note to look up why boy dolls would be wearing a blouse and a dress. Maybe it was a 19th century German thing. And I googled the price for one of these things, because I was gonna sell that shit to a museum the first second Nancy was off it. And sure enough, $250 to $300 was the price range. So the antique dealer didn't rip me off. For bedtime, Nancy asked me to put Georgie in his stand by her bed so he could watch over her as she slept, which I obliged. As I lay falling asleep in my bed, I heard Nancy talking to Georgie, talking to it about her day, how much fun she had, all the things they would do tomorrow, and just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard her call out, "Daddy, can you lay down Georgie? He's tired." I trudged over to her room, dead exhausted. "Sure thing, sweetheart, but please go to sleep. We had a long vacation and I need to rest before school tomorrow when I have to work." I picked Georgie up from his stand, laid him down next to Nancy's bed, and tucked the stand into the corner of the room before heading back to bed and conking out. I shot up in my bed, still only half awake, but my eyes were searching frantically in the dark. What was it that had woken me up? Pre-kids, I had been such a deep sleeper, but now my brain had trained me to wake up to anything out of the ordinary. I thought I had heard a rustle, and come to think of it, had I closed my door that far towards the frame? I almost left it open enough to be able to peer down the hall to see my daughter's door. Then again, I had been very tired. I checked my phone. 2:30 a.m. I crept to my door and slowly swung it open. Of course, like an idiot, I banged my knee with a thud, so much for stealth. I opened my door all the way, and there was Georgie standing there in the hall, motionless and facing me with that damn blank stare. "Oh, Nancy," I muttered. I walked to Georgie, lifted up with my right arm, then went to grab the stand with my left. But the stand wasn't there. Confused, I held Georgie out and placed it back onto his feet, steadied him, then let go. As before, the unbalanced doll slowly started to fall back and I steadied it again, trying to find the balance point Nancy had apparently found. I tried several times, but to no avail. I consider that this doll might have some underlying wire under its stuffing in the legs to help it stand on its own, and I pinched several sections of the thighs and calves and felt some rods, but when I tried to bend them, they wouldn't budge except at the knees, but even then it felt rigid and difficult to manipulate. I made my way up to the thigh. Maybe the hip joint was the best way to reposition the rods. There was some movement, but it still felt stiff. I was just about to give up and just throw the thing to the side, but then I brushed up against something with my elbow that had no right being there. I paused, then brought my right hand down and confirmed. I felt genitals. The doll came alive. "Get the fuck off me, you shit!" It howled with its raspy, sick voice, its stale, rotten breath invading my nostrils. Georgie viciously kicked, screamed, grabbed handfuls of my hair, and ripped. All I could do was try to throw it off, but the fucker was strong, and I hurled it to the ground, rolling along the floor to the staircase. "Fuck you, fuck you," it kept shouting as we fell down the stairs together. I landed on the doll at the base of the stairs, and I put my arm around its papier-mâché throat and crushed through it, my hands breaking the fragile material and feeling a warm, pulsing neck. Georgie grabbed in turn, his thumbs digging into my eyes with inhuman strength. I screamed and kept squeezing and stood, stumbling to the kitchen and thrust my left hand to the counter until I found a handle to my chef's knife. And I plunged the blade into Georgie's torso over and over. Stuffing flew up into the air with each stab, and I didn't stop. By my 15th stab, or so, I saw the doll's clothing turn a deep red, the thing now motionless, letting out small gurgles. I let go of the knife and sat back, heaving heavy breaths into my lungs. I looked up and saw my daughter's face frozen in horror. She had seen the whole thing. Blood slowly pooled around the doll's body. After a brief moment of silence, Nancy screamed. It was 6 a.m. and quiet in the police station. I sat before 2 detectives and a police officer from upstate New York, and had just finished my story for the 5th time. Each time they pressed me for as much detail as possible. Normally, no way in hell you could believe that story, but I called 911 and kept my eyes on that dead, bloody doll while shielding and consoling Nancy until the cops arrived. None of this disappearing monster bullshit. Do you recognize this man? The upstate New York policeman pushed forward a picture of a middle-aged, balding man. Yeah, he's the antique shop guy. The one that sold you the doll? The very same. Sold it for $60 instead of the original $300. The policeman and detectives looked at each other. Did they actually believe my story? Sorry, I need to know what's going on, I said. Was this some voodoo shit or a demon doll or... How about this picture? This time one of the detectives pushed it forward. It was the antique shop owner again, and I almost dismissed it as I looked away with a nod. But then I saw something perched on his shoulder. They've been running the scam for years, he said. The same story has been popping up for years, but with no hard evidence until now. Antique shop owner pushes the doll on vacationers, and they look like they have some money. And the following day, all their valuables are gone, plus the antique doll, of course. I scowled and shook my head. You see, this man's name is Igor, he said, pointing to the shopkeeper's shoulder. I looked closer. The small figure was emaciated, eyes sunken in, an odd smile on his narrow face, sitting comfortably on the antique shop owner's shoulder, his thick legs dangling over onto the shopkeeper's chest. He's what is known as a primordial dwarf. Extremely rare. He's only about 25 inches tall. I stared in disbelief. Just enough to fit in the doll suit. My hands covered my mouth. And if you hadn't barricaded your cabin door to protect against bears, you would have been cleaned out overnight. And then, on your first night back, you locked him in your car. So really this past night was his only opportunity to escape. The other detective spoke. And we confirmed a phone call to the antique shop was registered coming out of your house around midnight. He was going to clean you out right there and then and get picked up. I turned and looked across the hall into the other office, the one where Nancy and the child psychologist were talking. She seemed fine, at least from the back of her head. I just didn't know if I could ever get a wink of sleep again. Your daughter will be okay. It will take time for you both to recover. We're really sorry that this happened to you. Rest easy. We have a bad man behind bars, and another bad man that you rightfully killed in self-defense. The officer and detective stood up. My suggestion, personally, how about you stay away from buying any new dolls for the next couple of years? I stood up, never keeping my eyes off Nancy. I'm never buying another fucking doll again. I don't have much time to explain, so I'll try to give as much detail as I can. I live in a small neighborhood located on the outskirts of Arizona, and I barely interact with others. Some people see me as being antisocial and have tried to get me out and experience more of what life has to offer. It was all annoying and very stressful at times, but after a while, I guess you can say I opened up more. I began to communicate more with others and eventually found myself being invited out to parties and other local events. Fast forward a few months. It is now December and the holidays is now upon us. And this year I felt like doing something different. Instead of sitting at home and treating these upcoming days like any other, I decided to invite some people over to spend some time for the holiday. Though it was out of my comfort zone, I felt good about my decision. Only problem was, I didn't know much about my neighbors. Sure, I talked and went out with them from time to time, but I don't remember any of them talking about their personal life. So when I called up some friends from the neighborhood, they all had something to do with their families or already had other plans scheduled. This sort of bummed me out, but I didn't let it affect me too much. Later that day, it was about 5:30 p.m., and the sun was just beginning to set. I was sitting on my couch watching the fire as I sipped my freshly brewed tea. As I sat there, I noticed it was quite lonely, so I decided to play some music on my phone in an attempt to get into the holiday spirit. After a few minutes of tapping my foot and bobbing my head to the songs, the sound of a loud and aggressive knock came from my front door. My body froze, however it wasn't from fear. We didn't get any suspicious happenings around here, so this hardly gave me a scare. I turned down the music and approached the door. "Who is it?" I questioned as I grabbed the handle. There was no response, and I know I should have just asked again or just simply not opened the door at all, but unfortunately I wasn't thinking and opened it anyway. Standing in front of the doorway was a awfully tall man. He had to be about 6'2" at least. I myself am 5'10", so maybe it was just my height. His hair was a mess and his clothing seemed worn down. Hello? Can I help you with something?" The man didn't respond. He just stood there, swaying slightly back and forth. I swear I felt like I was standing in that doorway for hours. He took one last sway forward before stopping in a weird, awkward way. The way he stopped was quite unnatural and a little impressive, so to say. To give you an example, think of the dance move Michael Jackson does when he stands on his toes. Only difference is that he was still flat on his feet. His legs stretched out and his face was just inches away from mine. I pulled my head back and put a hand on my shoulder. "Listen, if you don't need anything, then I advise you to move on." I gave him a slight push on his shoulder, and when doing this, the man's head quickly twitched towards my hand. He then leaned back into a normal, upright stance. Again, complete silence. After a few seconds, maybe 10 or so, the man pulled back his hair to reveal his eyes, giving me a clear view of his entire face. The man was well shaved and had a huge grin. His eyes were severely widened, and he slowly opened his mouth as if he was going to speak. I burst out in a stern voice. "Alright, I think it's time for you to get off my..." "Oh, my apologies. I was just strolling around the neighborhood and realized you were the only one home. No family to go?" I squinted at the man before responding. "No, just me. Though if that's all you have to ask, then I suggest you be on your way." The man looked above my head into my house, surveying the inside before turning to look down the street. "You see that house down there, right behind the other two? That's where I stay. I hardly take walks like this, for the others never seem willing to speak to me. Except, well, you of course." At this point, I didn't know what to say. All I really could do was stand there in confusion. "Oh, I guess I haven't properly introduced myself. My name is..." "Just get the hell off my property." The man stared. "Hmm?" I don't know what began to set me off so much, but I was fed up and wanted him to leave. You heard me. Get the hell out of here. The man's grin disappeared and instead was replaced by a deep frown, clearly filled with irritation. Very well then. He turned around and walked off down the street towards the direction of his home. I closed the door and sat back down, too frustrated to continue playing music. I sighed as I rubbed my eyes. It was about 2 hours later, and it was now completely dark outside. I must have dozed off because I remember quickly opening my eyes and sitting up to see that the fire was out, and the house was completely dark. I reached over to turn on the lamp beside my couch, and as soon as the light switched on, it switched right back off. Huh? I tried turning it back on countless times before getting up and trying other switches. None of the lights were turning on and I assumed the power was out. I put on my shoes and coat and went out the back door to check the fuse box. Normally, in some places, the box will be in the basement, but for mine, it sat right behind my house attached to the wall. I opened the panel and squinted as I flicked multiple switches back and forth. As I was doing this, I felt the feeling of being watched. I stopped what I was doing and turned around to see the man standing about a couple yards away. Now, there is a set of woods behind my house and they aren't that deep, but it takes about 10 minutes to travel through. The man stood there right in front of them, back facing towards me. After analyzing and making sure it was him and not some random, I shook my head and turned back to the fuse. Weirdo. After flicking one of the switches, a giant spark burst out from the box. Shit, I muttered, covering my face from the sparks. I turned to observe my surroundings, refusing to face the box out of frustration. That's when I locked eyes with him. The man was now facing in my direction, same frown as before after telling him to leave. This creeped me out a bit, but I still didn't let it get to me. Still there, huh? No response. Instead, his frown turned into a wide, inhuman, ear-to-ear smile, and his eyes widened even more than before. What the fuck? The man darted in my direction, his body slightly hunched forward and his arms spread out as if he was ready to embrace me in a bear hug. His fingers were bent, and I could see a few veins form through the skin on his forehead. The speed he was running at wasn't normal. It wasn't even something you'd see from an Olympic runner. It was more of a superhuman type of speed. After a few seconds, I finally gained the control to move and haul ass back inside. I slammed the door shut and locked it immediately. What the hell was that? I stepped away from my door, backing up into my living room. I don't think I took my eyes off the door for even a second. Let me in. The man's voice came from the window by the front door. His voice was deep, raspy, and made my blood curdle. I was afraid to turn around. I imagined seeing his face pressed up against the window, same inhuman-like smile and wide eyes. But when I turned, he wasn't there. Let me in. Again I heard his voice. This time it came from the window by the back door. This continued on for about 15 more seconds before I yelled out, "What the hell do you want from me?" I stormed towards the door and swung it open, ready to attack whatever was behind it. Immediately, an aggressive breeze passed by me and into my house. I looked around and the man was nowhere to be found. I closed the door and stomped over to the back and opened it with the same movement as before. Nothing. After closing the door, I walked back into my living room, grabbed my phone, and did what I should have done at the very beginning. Dial 911. It took a few rings for them to finally pick up. When they did, I didn't give them any time to speak. Hello? There's a crazed man outside and I need you guys to send somebody out quick. Silence for about a second. It felt as if nobody was on the other end. That's when I heard his breathing. I'm inside your house. The phone fell out of my hand as I felt a strong, sinister presence behind me. I hurried and ran upstairs to my room. I grabbed my laptop that sat on my dresser and slammed the door, jumping into the closet behind a set of clothes. It's been about 45 minutes and I can still hear him, moving around, whispering, calling out to me with laughter. He's getting closer and it won't be long before he finds me. Calling the police didn't work, so I'm hoping this message will. I can hear his footsteps getting louder, heavier, and his voice turning into a more demonic tone. At this point, it sounds like he's crawling on the walls. Or is it the ceiling? He's right outside my door now. He's muttering something. From what I hear, it sounds like a chant. Please, if anyone finds this, send help. I don't think I have much time left. God help me. Have you ever wandered around in a department store and felt like the aisles are never ending? In my town, there's a store where the aisles quite literally never end. It's called Aisles Ends. This is a place that most would describe as liminal, with an incomprehensible layout and indiscernible amounts of floors. It appears like any other mega department store with 3 levels above ground. Brown brick covered in ivy and thistle. Sticking out in a quiet outdoor mall is a monolith of convenience. Well, this doesn't seem too far from normal. What is quite unusual is the shopping floors continue, but underground. Once again, this isn't the strangest thing in the world, it's just quirky. What is strange is the products that become available the further down you go. However, this was just what I'd heard from a friend. Personally, I've only ever done normal shopping there. In fact, I brought the very laptop I'm typing the story on in the electronic department. So, being the curious cat that I am, I went on a local message board for my town to see if anyone had info about what was in the department store lower levels. These are the posts in chronological order. Hey guys, my name is Shayna, and I went down to the basement of Alley's for the first time this week. I've been 2 times since, and I'm going again today. The first basement is sporting goods and such. Bats, bear traps, guns, bows, a variety of arrows and targets. This isn't too strange, right? Everyone knows a sportsman or two. The next level is holistic medicine. However, you'll find these brightly colored vials on display in the dimly lit sales floor like a penchant for rendering those who consume them unconscious. I've heard some even produce an effect that leaves one paralyzed from the neck down, unable to defend themselves from a would-be attacker. The third floor might satiate those with a taste for the more deviant things in the bedroom. Bondage. This is where you will find more handcuffs than a police headquarters. Chains that would be the ghost of Christmas passed to shame are typically on sale, buy one get one free. Locks are typically on sale as well as a decent deal. The next floor is where it really kicks off. People. All different kinds, and all have been drugged out of their minds. They sit docile in small cages staring into space. They are quite pricey, but you can put them on layaway. This is as far as I have gone, but I often see those go further down the crimson escalator, taking you deeper. These are people I've never seen again in my small town. Anyway, I've got some business to attend to. My boyfriend has been cheating on me and I'd like to visit the lower levels of Alley's Ends to pick up his Christmas present. The next came off as more of a plea for help. May 13th, 2014. My father took me shopping at Alley's Ends last week, and he went missing right out of the department store. We were shopping for my mother's retirement gift. My parents are older, mid-60s. Mom was a school teacher and Dad was a bus driver. That's how they met. We wanted to get her a new vanity table or something of the sort, but Dad decided to check out the sporting goods. He wanted a new gun for the fall hunting season. We looked around for an employee when we couldn't initially find sporting goods, but no matter where we looked, we didn't find a single employee. Eventually, we wandered into the basement and found what we were looking for. Interestingly enough, there were employees down there. I remember thinking it peculiar that the only employees were in the basement. Then I thought, how do you check out? I thought back to all the times I'd shopped at alleys and I couldn't even picture what their front counter looked like, or remember checking out. The employees down here were strange, on top of few and far between. When I would happen to see an employee, they'd be walking in a swift stride, several paces ahead of me, nearing a corner. Every single time I ran into one of them, I'd call out to ask for help, but they'd continue like they'd never heard me, and disappear around a corner. The only way I could even tell they were most likely staff was because they'd all be wearing the same neat black button-up and smooth pressed khakis. Eventually, my father got frustrated with the wait for help. In a puff, he abandoned his merchandise and began striding in a direction that must have been his best guess of an exit. Soon, I was falling behind, and much like the employees, my father was just far enough away that I couldn't grab his attention. I was rounding the corner to the gun safe aisle when I saw his favorite bright red hat with white lettering laying abandoned in front of a safe. I called his name and continued looking for him for hours, but I never found him. I went to the police a day later and reported my father missing to a police department that wasn't keen on finding a lost grown man. Begrudgingly, the police eventually went to alleys to try and get a hold of some camera footage that could potentially give them a lead to find my father. I do not know what they encountered at alleys, but when they briefed me on their visit, they basically called me crazy and said that there is no basement. Am I being gaslit by these officers? Or did something unthinkable happen to my dad? November 2nd, 2015. Hey y'all. I'm posting here because I saw something today at the alley's ends while I was Christmas shopping that I can't get out of my head. I'm 16 and I was shopping for my little sister's Christmas present at Alley's. I got my first job and car this year, so it's my first holiday where I get to shop for people on my own, and I don't think I'll be doing this again next year. I was in the girls' clothing department, irritated at the little girls and boys running around, probably still in a sugar rush from Halloween. My mom always said to start your shopping right after Halloween if you want the best deals, so that's just what I was doing. There was a little boy there with his preteen sisters. The girls were wrapped up in an intense conversation that brought a smile to my lips. They were debating who some dystopian girl should end up with and whatever preteen romance sensation was sweeping the nation at the moment. Intruding on their filibuster was a textbook obnoxious little brother, snot-faced, red-headed, and full of piss and vinegar. This kid was out of control, pestering them, jumping through clothing racks, tearing underneath shelves, shouting and laughing. This little boy was even getting on my last nerve, but I did my best to ignore him. I was perusing the sweaters when I heard a blood-curdling scream. The little pissant had made his way into the changing room and walked in on some poor young girl. He uttered a snickering apology and then took off running. As he ran past his sisters, one stuck her foot out and tripped him. The little boy flew in the air gloriously in a karmic flight before landing with a thud onto the floor, sprawled out and wailing. As his sisters laughed and whipped out their phones to take pictures, my heart stopped. Something was wrapped around his ankle. I immediately began taking massive steps towards the boy, putting my irritation behind me and putting instinct first. As I got closer, the boy began to scream in horror instead of cry. There were clothes wrapping around his wrists and ankles, dragging him toward the fully stocked racks of discount jeans. He screamed his red face off, snot flying everywhere. As I reached him, I looked back to his sisters and realized they'd fled the scene. I pulled on the boy as I watched a silky dress cover his crying face, muffling his screams. I began to cry as I wrapped my body around his. Something was trying to pull this boy to the rack. I had to think fast. As I heard his breathing get shallow, the boy was starting to suffocate. I looked down. He was completely covered in various pieces of clothing and writhing in fear. I got off of him and dashed towards the racks, hoping to ram right into whoever or whatever was trying to take this boy. As I crashed into the racks, they all fell over, sending cheap clothing flying everywhere. The girls' department was a technicolor nightmare of shirts and dresses, depicting rainbows and unicorns. It was ironic that such a joyful style of clothes was becoming sentient and trying to eat some 8-year-old boy. I clambered out of the clothing pile and began digging for the boy. I tore furiously through the clothing until 2 pale white arms emerged from the pile and wrapped tightly around my neck. The boy was crying vigorously and clinging to me when his parents and sisters found us. I found out his name was Henry. Henry and I told them he'd been pinned under a fallen rack, and his irate mother scooped him up, thanked me, and went to hunt down a manager. I scowled as his sisters walked by, and briskly made my way to my car. I ordered my sister's present online. I'm not going back to that place anytime soon. Now, I did my research after reading these, and I found out a few things. There was a woman in my town under suspicion of murdering her boyfriend after he was found dead at his place of work. However, she was released after they failed to determine the cause of death. The poor man was found in an elevator, turned inside out. Interpret that as you will. Another man had contacted the police after purchasing a gun safe and finding a decomposing man's body in it. No leads were ever disclosed to the public as to how this man came to be in his steely grave. And finally, a young man of 15 years was hospitalized last month after having a severe panic attack at a local clothing store, claiming the clothes were trying to eat him again. There were more posts, but these were the most interesting ones that I could find. I'm tempted to make my trip to Allie's, but I'm also terrified. I have been a homicide detective for almost 20 years, but nothing has ever stuck with me as much as Samantha's case. Actually, it's not Samantha's case. It was her parents that were killed, and their Rottweiler. Samantha will probably never be right after that night. She still hasn't spoken a word to anyone, although if I'm going to tell this story, I should start at the beginning. August was always my busiest time of year. The heat made people irritable, and for some people, the heightened irritability turned them into murders. Anyway, this was about 9 in the morning when I received the call. I remember because it woke me up. I had been up all night investigating a bar fight that had escalated until one of the men killed the other by crushing his throat with the leg of a bar stool. The arrest and CSI had gone smoothly, and given the dozen witnesses that gave statements, the prosecution would be a piece of cake. Even then, I hadn't gotten home until 6 in the morning. I'm rambling. I apologize. I ramble when I'm nervous and I haven't slept in 2 days. The caffeine pills are keeping me awake, but they have amplified my fear. Like I was saying, I arrived at the scene at about 9:30 a.m. It was already 90 degrees. Dispatch had received a call from Samantha's grandmother. The responding officers called in to report that Grandma had arrived to pick up Samantha for the weekend and discovered the bodies. I was tired and had driven through a coffee stand on my way there. It was only able to drink about half of it because I dropped the other half when I walked into the living room. There was blood on every surface of the room, not covered completely, but splattered. The bodies of Samantha's father was lying on the living room floor. The 100-pound Rottweiler was only a few feet away, and Samantha's mother was in the kitchen. Her cell phone was smashed into her hand as if she had been trying to call 911. They were all smashed, actually. I have never seen anything like it, although I fear I will again. The bodies looked like they had fallen from a plane without a parachute, or, more accurately, someone had dropped a pallet of bricks on them from a plane. Samantha was still in the corner of the living room when I got there. She was clutching a doll. Her and the doll were also covered in blood. The responding officers were still there when I showed up. They explained she had been unharmed physically, but the paramedics said she was in shock. She acted as if she wasn't aware we were even in the room. I kneeled down and tried to ask her what happened. She ignored me and continued with that 1,000-yard stare I had seen on several other victims of violent crimes. I tried several times to get her attention. I think it was the magnitude of the crime scene, the amount of blood, everywhere that had gotten to me. Maybe it was the heat, or maybe it was the lack of sleep. Whatever it was, I lost my cool. "What happened here, Samantha?" I demanded in a raised voice. I grabbed her by the arms and shook her while I asked the question. She didn't look at me, but the doll did. That's when I noticed it wasn't a doll at all. It was an old, vintage nutcracker. It was probably me shaking her, but I could have sworn that it turned its head and looked right at me. Its face was still covered in blood. I knew immediately I was out of line. Her grandmother snapped at me and I stood and waved a hand of acknowledgement. I walked up the stairs to get away from the bodies. I needed a break. While I was up there, I looked into the bedrooms. I found a large amount of heroin in the master bedroom. In Samantha's bedroom, I found her diary sitting on the bed. I figured the odds were slim, but she may have written about something that could help. I asked CSI a bit to bag the drugs and the diary for evidence. Later that night, I received a call from the coroner. He told me that the victims had been hammered to death, or peached to death. I didn't believe him. He clarified that each body had been crushed slowly by thousands of rectangular impacts. The bodies were so badly damaged, he couldn't be sure, but each impact seemed to have an equal amount from top and bottom. In the morning, I confirmed that both victims had criminal records for drug trafficking. They were affiliated with a local gang, and given the large amounts of drugs found in the house, I made the case that the homicide should be transferred to the gang task force. My captain agreed and took me off the case. It wasn't until I was leaving for the day that I saw the diary in the evidence bag on my desk. I intended to drop it off at the gang task force on my way out, but my curiosity got the best of me. I took it home. Once I was home, over a few glasses of scotch, I read the diary. The last 3 entries are as follows. August 11th. Mommy and Daddy are fighting again. I went out after school so I wouldn't have to listen to them. The best thing ever happened, though. The old lady down the streets were having a yard sale, and I found a big doll. One of the ladies told me it was a magic nutcracker. It has special powers. I don't know what it means, but when I asked to buy it, they said I could have it as a gift. I hid it in my room. Mommy says the old ladies are witches, and Daddy says they worship the devil. I know they wouldn't let me keep it if they knew who gave it to me. August 12th. Daddy hit Mommy because she lost one of the bags they hide under their bed. I tried to stop him, but he hit me too. My head hurts and I just want to go to sleep. Recently, Daddy hits me almost every day. I don't know why he doesn't love me anymore. August 13th. I snuck downstairs to get juice and drink it in my room. I just wanted to stay out of sight so Mommy and Daddy wouldn't yell at me. But I spilled my juice on the doll. I took his jacket off to wash it. When I did, I saw a bunch of weird writing on it. I tried to read it out loud, but it didn't make any sense. But when I did, it came to life. The magic nutcracker told me he would be my friend. He would protect me from anyone who put their hands on me. That last entry was from the day Samantha's parents were killed. I know you will read this and think I'm crazy, but I know I saw that doll look at me, and I know I shook that girl. I wasn't trying to hurt her. I just wanted to snap her out of her shock. I also know you won't believe me, but I have been seeing that nutcracker all day, out of the corner of my eye, everywhere I go. So I'm writing this just in case I die. I want someone to know what happened.